Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, a radical approach to threat intel management. It's sponsored by Palo Alto Networks and broadcast by Informa. My name's Peter Krass. I'm with Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I have just a few very quick announcements. First of all, this webinar is designed to be interactive. There's a dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen, and that will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media, and participate in the Q&A session that we'll have toward the end. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, no need to click. Also, you can download a copy of the slides. You do that via the resources widget. Toward the end of the webinar, we'll ask you to complete a survey that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. And I hope you'll take a minute to fill out the survey before you leave us today. Your feedback provides us with valuable information on how we can improve these events in the future. Finally, if you have any technical problems during this webinar, please click the Help widget. That's at the bottom of your screen. Or you can type your issue right into the Q&A area. And either way, we'll be glad to give you one-on-one assistance. Let's move on to our presentation, A Radical Approach to Threat Intel Management. We have two speakers today. First of all, we've got Ryan Clow. He's Senior Product Manager at Palo Alto Networks. Ryan is responsible for guiding the success of new product capabilities within Cortex XSOAR. Over his career, Ryan has focused on threat intelligence, and he's worked as an SOC analyst, written production code for security applications, and delivered research reports on malware. We have Kyle Wilhoit, he's Senior Manager for Threat Research at the Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 team. Kyle is an internationally recognized security researcher with more than a decade of experience. He helps research teams deliver original and organized threat intelligence and research. In his current role, Kyle manages a team of world-renowned threat researchers, and they identify, track, and unearth technical intelligence related to actor groups present in hacker tools, attack frameworks, targeted attack campaigns, and families of malware. Before we get started, however, I'm going to ask everyone to help us out with a couple of polls. And here's your first poll on the screen. Very simple, just a yes or no question. Do you have a dedicated threat intelligence program? Please click on the correct answer for your application, either yes or no. Press submit. And let's get a feel for where we are. So do you have a dedicated threat intelligence program? Yes, you do. No, you don't. Let's take a look. Well, it's almost half and half. We've got just about 55% saying yes, you do have a dedicated threat intelligence program, and a little over 45% saying no, you do not. Okay, so that's good. Now let's take our second of two polls. Do you leverage threat hunting on your own internal data? And again, very simple, either yes, we do, or no, we don't. I'll give everybody a second. Do you leverage threat hunting on your own internal data? Yes or no? Let's take a look. Whoop, what happened here? Let's go back. Let's try it again. Ah, there we go. Wow. Well, it said 100%. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. We had a little technical glitch there. No, 54% do not leverage threat hunting. And about 46, a little, not quite half, saying, yes, we do. All right. Thank you, everybody, for participating in our polls. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan and Kyle.
All right. Thank you, Peter. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Basically, I wanted to talk a little bit about how enterprise customers today are using threat intelligence, kind of what I'm seeing in my customer base in the threat intel space today. So I'm happy to see that our polls kind of match the numbers here that I brought for the presentation. But this is what SANS is telling us, right? About half of enterprise organizations out there today have some sort of dedicated cyber threat intelligence program, or at least a dedicated threat intelligence analyst. And over half, about 56% of customers today are consuming threat intelligence data in their security operations centers, right? They're using this for alerting, for proactive blocking of known threats as part of their alerting pipeline, right? So this is something that we see growing. And almost all of those SOCs, right, are consuming that threat intel for the purpose of detection. So this is by far the number one use case for the threat intel customers today is consuming those indicators and using those to enhance your detection pipeline. We do still see some challenges though, right? When I'm talking to my customers, I see in the threat intel space some very common challenges today. The first is just too much noise. And this is very similar to the alert fatigue story that so many of us know in the security space, right? On the threat intel side, what's happening is there is so much threat intelligence being created today. Lots of new vendors coming online with threat intel services, lots of new ISACs, information sharing and analysis centers coming online for different industry verticals or different geolocations. And there's an expectation from security leadership and from the market in general that security teams need to consume this threat intel information and operationalize it somehow. And you need some sort of tool, right, that can take this data, normalize it for you, and give you kind of a single source of truth for your threat intel. And we're also seeing, again, tool silos, a kind of familiar story if you've been in the security industry for a while. But specifically on the threat intel side, what we're seeing is as customers stand up a threat intel program, right, one of the things that they're doing is they start aggregating and kind of centralizing their threat intel data. And if you're storing all of your threat intelligence in its own place, it can be difficult to operationalize. The first use case we see with a lot of customers is they want to take that threat intelligence and integrate it into their SOC and IR alerts for enrichment. And if you have all your threat intel in a different tool over in a different database away from your SOC and incident response, you don't have to spend a lot of engineering time kind of integrating those two tools together. And then finally, beyond the SOC and incident response, if you want to take your threat intelligence and send it to your firewall, send it to your SIEM for alerting and proactive blocking, we see challenges there around building out integrations, complexity with network segmentations. Like how do you actually take a specific set of intelligence and send it to your security devices? Right, so those are the challenges we're seeing today. And we continue to see some solutions around scoring, around finding relevant indicators. We felt that here at Palo Alto, we have a great foundation with our SOAR product, XSOAR, and a lot of these needs can be met basically out of the box with an automation solution. So what we see is this kind of process, right? There's a lot of manual processes in the security space as well. Again, from the threat intel perspective, you have your kind of security analysts, your security operations along the top, right? They have their own workflows of bringing in indicators. And then customers stand up a threat intel program, and they also now are bringing in indicators, right? So now you have kind of two duplicate flows coming in of intelligence. It's coming in through the SOC. They're doing their hunting. They're looking in their SIMs. They're trying to keep track of all this intelligence. And your threat intel program is also doing the same. They're collecting indicators, and they're opening tickets to share that intelligence with your SOC. And there's a lot of manual process here. And this is very ripe for automation, ripe for a SOAR type of product. So what we've done is we've taken Cortex XSOAR and built on top a threat intel management capability. So you can now bring in threat intelligence feeds, manage those in the product. You can analyze those indicators using playbooks to understand how relevant they are to you, then ultimately take some sort of action, whether that's using those indicators to enrich your alerts for your SOC and incident response team, or ultimately integrating if you want to proactively block indicators in your firewall or alert on indicators in your SIEM, you can do that as well. So this is what that kind of workflow looks like after implementing something like a threat intel management solution. Right now, instead of a bunch of disjointed processes, you have a single pipeline where all of your threat intel is being aggregated. And now your different stakeholders of threat intel can work out of that common tool, right? Whether that's your SOC, whether that's your threat intel program, whether that's your firewall admins who need to pull out known good indicators out of that platform, they have a common place to go with a common set of workflows and automations to deliver that intelligence where it needs to be. All right, so this is the number one use case that we see customers, how they use threat intelligence today, right? We're seeing you want to collect, you want a single point of collection for your threat intel feed sources. So you see on the left is just some examples of that. You bring in all these feeds into a common place. You start doing analysis of these indicators, right? You want to enrich them. You want to see if any of your business partner IP ranges are in there, for example. Make sure those are removed out. Get those aggregated into a single place. And that's where the automation comes in, right? We can do all that automated work for you. And then on top of that, you can also bring in that manual threat research. And that's what Kyle is going to talk about in a minute, is his process for how they're doing their manual threat research. And you can take both of those data sets, both the manual data that's being added by the analysts and all the automated feed data, and start building prioritized either block lists or alert lists to send to your relevant tools, like your SIEMs or your firewalls. So this is a very common use case. This is what we see a lot of customers doing today, and it really helps improve their security posture by making sure they're not missing things being reported through their threat intel pipelines. All right, so with that, I want to pass it over to Kyle to walk through his recent research and the XHunt campaign.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ryan. So my name is Kyle Wilhoit, and as mentioned earlier, I'm the Senior Manager of the Threat Analysis Unit on Unit 42. And today I'm specifically going to be talking about kind of some of that manual intelligence gathering that Ryan had mentioned. And I'm going to be talking about a campaign called XHunt, which is actually a campaign conducted by a likely Middle Eastern threat actor group. And I'm going to give some kind of details kind of surrounding what that campaign looks like and different kind of intelligence that we unearthed over about a 2-year period. So kind of jumping right in, before we kind of jump into the most recent activity that Unit 42 researchers have unearthed and researched, it's kind of important to mention XHunt's historical activity over the past kind of 2 years. So kind of from the Unit 42 research perspective, the XHunt campaign has been active since at least July of 2018, and we've seen the particular group behind this campaign targeting Kuwaiti government, shipping, and transportation organizations. One thing of kind of note regarding XHunt is that it has been unique primarily in its targeting of Kuwait organizations. It really hasn't gone outside of Kuwait too much, so there's kind of an interesting TTP regarding the campaign itself. The actual name for the campaign itself is a name based on a manga series called Hunter x Hunter, and we'll also see throughout some of the tools themselves that the backdoors, as well as some of the tool names, reflect the name specifically in Hunter x Hunter. Throughout the entire 2-year entirety of our research efforts into this particular campaign, there's been several custom backdoors, tools, and other web shell tools that have been unearthed as part of our research. And I'll talk about some of those in a little bit greater detail as we kind of step through some of this research. So diving right in, our first insight into the XHunt campaign was actually a tweet that was unearthed in July 2018. It's kind of interesting to note that, within Unit 42, our research is done over a multitude of different ways. And what I mean by that is we unearth research not only from our own data sources internally, but we also unearth them from external data sources, such as Twitter. The individual in this case mentions that he received an email that was also targeting some government agencies in the state of Kuwait. The emails contained a link to download a document, which contained a macro that would install a PowerShell-based tool that I'll talk about here in just a minute, that communicated with a specific domain called firewallsupports.com. This kind of drew our attention because anytime that we start to see kind of any type of macro documents being leveraged, it immediately starts to draw our attention. And researchers within Unit 42 will then start to go in and pivot on that activity, trying to unearth any additional research that we can from that. We can see the macro documents here, and we can see that if the images were embedded and working properly, that we would see that those also mirrored what the actual content of the macro documents were. If we kind of look at this historically, in 2018, as I mentioned, the first kind of activity that Unit 42 had unearthed and witnessed. In this case, a majority of the activity that we witnessed in 2018 were macro documents targeting, as I mentioned before, Kuwaiti industry and government bodies. There was realistically 2 backdoors that Unit 42 researchers had unearthed at that time during the 2018 period. One of which is called Cache 200, and that's just merely a simple PowerShell backdoor. And it basically just allows C2 server commands being issued to and from the actual malware itself using a pretty simple command of cmd/c. So the interaction with the actual tool itself is quite easy, and it's relatively simple. Additionally, there was a second tool that we unearthed during that time called Sakatova. This tool can run as a command line tool or via a GUI, and Sakatova provides the actor the ability to upload specific files to a server via an FTP, allows the attackers to take screenshots, create RDP sessions via the PuTTY plink tool, as well as scan tertiary or secondary systems for open ports to kind of look for secondary access and or possible lateral movement. If we continue looking into 2019, this is where we start to see a little bit of XHunt's TTPs change. And what I mean by that is we started to then witness the targeting of email servers as well as IIS servers in the XHunt campaign. We also saw that tools were specifically being designed at that time to target instances exactly in that fashion, meaning targeting email services and targeting IIS servers. In this case, we unearthed 3 specific tools that XHunt had leveraged as part of their campaign of kind of importance. All of these matched to that Hunter x Hunter naming scheme that I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, one of which was called IOCs, which is a general purpose backdoor that allows and gives access to the attackers on an infected system for a persistent period of time. Netero, which is a variant of IOCs, which is also just a general purpose backdoor. And then Gone, which is mostly a post-exploitation tool that has capabilities like scanning the environment, looking for open ports. And the interesting kind of side note here is that it requires the same password as the Sakatova tool, and also has some additional functionality that's shared between kind of IOCs as well as Netero. So we can start to draw some correlation lines between the actors' tools themselves, as well as kind of what the function of those tools are. So we can start to build out that wider web of intelligence gathering and enrichment just by simply looking at some of those shared passwords and some of those shared functionalities between malware families. So kind of some interesting points there. If we jump into 2020, we can start to see and continue to see a lot of the targeting of email servers and IIS servers that I had mentioned earlier. There were 3 particular malware families or 3 particular tools that we had unearthed during our research within 2020. And I'll talk a little bit greater about some of this here momentarily. One tool is called Try5, which is a PowerShell script that provides backdoor access to a compromised Exchange server, as I mentioned earlier, using a different command and control channel to communicate with the actors. So it's kind of leveraging a new way for C2 communications. Then there's also a malware family called Snuggie, which allows an attacker to obtain the system information, such as host names, as well as running native commands on the infected host itself. And it's also kind of important to note that Snuggie is actually a variant of the Cache 200 backdoor that I mentioned earlier in the presentation during 2018. So what we start to notice is that this actor group behind this campaign is actually and actively going out and not only modifying and creating variants of malware families that they've already used in the past, but they're doing it with a pretty significant amount of accuracy and lethality behind that malware. So kind of interesting in that case. And then the third tool that we unearthed was a web shell called Bumblebee, which I'll actually talk about in more detail here in just a few moments. So if we were to look at XHunt's entire timeline view of activity, we can start to see a couple different pivot points. One specific area that we kind of notice is that, as I mentioned before, we have some activity that we mentioned in early July of 2018, which was the tweet regarding the attacks on Kuwaiti governmental organizations. And that's initially, as I mentioned earlier, what drew Unit 42's attention to this activity. As we start to kind of go outward from that, you can start to see then we witnessed activity in June of 2019 as well as in May of 2019. In both of those cases, we noticed targeted attacks on Kuwaiti shipping organizations in both cases. And at that point, we then started to kind of pivot backwards, meaning, okay, what did we see historically with this information? We're tracking the actor as well as the campaign rather closely, but it's important for us to understand the historical context and historically what the actors and what this campaign has targeted. We started to do some reverse pivoting and noticed that the oldest known Sakaboda-related domain was registered in late December of 2017. So we can actually say that activity was more than likely in late 2017, or what we would consider kind of staging of the environment, making sure that everything is ready to go in late 2017. And then it became operationalized in 2018. And then finally, kind of if we continue to extrapolate that all the way down, you can see then in September 2020, we unearthed a Bumblebee web shell being leveraged at 2 different Kuwaiti organizations. And that was actually throughout the middle of September that we started to witness this activity. So it's kind of, again, important to understand all of XHunt's related actor infrastructure and actor information, as well as all of the activity that's been kind of done by this actor since December 2017. But now that I've kind of covered historically what we've seen with XHunt, I briefly wanted to kind of dive into the Bumblebee web shell. The Bumblebee web shell is kind of an interesting case study because we had actually found Bumblebee hosted on an internal IIS web server. As I mentioned, that's kind of their TTP changes over the past year and a half or 2 years. But we had unearthed that Bumblebee was actually hosted on an internal organization in Kuwait, a shipping organization. We noticed that this web shell was actually embedded on an IIS web server that was compromised. It was also distributed on a compromised Exchange server within that organization as well. And we initially unearthed this in September of 2020. We had kind of done this investigation as part of being looped into the incident itself, meaning, hey, we got reached out to, there were some compromised IIS web servers and Exchange web servers. What's the situation behind that? And that's where we dove in then and found this web shell hosted on that site. The investigation itself resulted in the discovery of several new backdoors in a web shell that I had mentioned already, Tri5, Snuggie, and Bumblebee. Bumblebee specifically is kind of interest because it allows for 3 core main functionalities. It allows, first of all, for the uploading and downloading of files specifically to and from the compromised Exchange or IIS server. It also allows the attackers to run commands that the actors use to discover additional systems. And then it also provided the capability for the attacker to move laterally to other servers on the network itself. So it's a full functioning web shell that the attackers had designed just solely for this campaign. It's also kind of important to mention, I've been asked the question many times over the past several months, why was Bumblebee named this? And the reason that we named Bumblebee Bumblebee is because, as you can see in the screenshot, the web shell includes a color scheme of white, black, and yellow. So it seemed to fit really well, and that's the consistent color scheme that the entire web shell has kind of seen as we watched it propagate in the environment. If we continue looking at the actual web shell itself, we kind of noticed some interesting pieces about it. First of all, we noticed that the actor had used SSH tunnels to directly interact with the Bumblebee web shell for 3 core reasons. The first reason that the actors leveraged SSH tunnels is to be able to interact directly with Bumblebee on IIS servers that are compromised, that are not directly accessible via the internet. Gives them the capability to access and interact directly with the web shell without having to jump directly through the internet in clear text with possible clarity behind that. Additionally, this allowed the attackers to connect to the non-internet accessible remote desktop protocol on Windows, specifically to interact with systems that are, again, not necessarily internet-facing or internet accessible. And then the third piece behind this, or the third reason why the actors decided to use SSH tunnels, is to move laterally to other systems within the network itself, the compromised network, so internal address space, for instance, specifically to access those internal systems that, again, are not accessible via the internet. It's also kind of interesting to note that one of the key functionalities behind this particular web shell is that it requires the actors to supply one password to view the web shell and a second password to interact with that web shell. So it's kind of interesting because there's two different passwords that are required for the web shell, both to be able to access it and view the actual data, as well as a second layer of access that would then let the actor go out and perform direct integration and run direct commands on the compromised host. Another kind of interesting post to this is that the actor used VPNs provided by a very popular public VPN provider called Private Internet Access. Then that's what the actors had leveraged actually to connect into Bumblebee web servers, and they did that primarily to hide their source IPs. This isn't necessarily a new activity that we've watched or witnessed with actor groups, but it's interesting because they used a rather well-known provider, again, Private Internet Access, to actually access those web shells themselves. And again, what that's intended to do is throw off the scent from a forensic investigation or an incident response process on that specific box that's compromised. One additional note behind the web shell is the commands that are executed on the servers themselves suggest that a tool called plink or putty link was used to create the SSH tunnels. And this is a rather popular tool that's used by both nefarious actors as well as legitimate systems engineers alike. And it just is intended to not only be functional, but also kind of hide traffic underneath the radar of traditional kind of host inspection technologies that exist out there today. So moving on, we're finally going to briefly talk about the Bumblebee infrastructure. It's important to mention this because Bumblebee relied upon, again, not only SSH tunnels, but then also on private internet access and VPN tunnels to be able to leverage and access these different environments. One kind of important thing is using IIS logs from the compromised servers, we were able to basically observe the actor logging into a compromised email account, and then carry out specific activities once they have logged in, such as viewing emails, searching for other email accounts on the compromised network, and just generally probing for general and additional information. As I mentioned before, inbound requests to the Bumblebee web shell did not provide any pivots. And this is primarily, again, because they were leveraging VPN providers. So it didn't really give us, from an investigations perspective, it didn't really give us much of a viewpoint or hopping off platform to then be able to pivot and hunt on within an infrastructure perspective. Ideally, many attackers in the past, if they don't leverage VPN IPs or any type of exit points such as that, were able to then correlate a little bit more as to who the actors might be behind the actual activity. Fortunately, however, we were able to extract specific XHunt infrastructure used as the remote servers for the SSH tunnels that I mentioned earlier that the actor created to access the systems via RDP and other internal web services. Ultimately, from accessing that specific SSH tunnel information, we were able to see some infrastructure bleed over with part of the Hisaka backdoor, which I mentioned in 2019 and 2018 being prevalent. And that's where we started to then see bleed over between current XHunt activity and previous XHunt activity in the past. And that's how we started to map this out into kind of a larger web of activity, both from a tooling perspective, but then also from an infrastructure perspective, because we typically analyze both of those in kind of their own environments or own silos. So based on all of this, I'm going to pass it back now to Ryan to kind of give us a demo into how this can be leveraged within the XSOAR tool itself and how you can kind of visualize it with our tool.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. So yeah, at this point, I want to talk about briefly, how can we take all this great research that folks like Kyle are doing, and hopefully for some of you, you have people like Kyle on your teams who are doing this type of research, looking at specific threat actors, specific campaigns, and malware families which are targeting your environment. How can we take this manual research, combine it with all the great automated threat intel feeds that are out there, and kind of leverage it as necessary, right? So in the demo, I want to walk you through the process of taking that manually vetted research, all of the network infrastructure that Kyle has taken, and create a block list for your firewall, right? That's the first use case. You want, when you're proactively blocking, you want to make sure that's high confidence, manually vetted data. And then we'll take a second list, which combines that data from Kyle and a threat intel feed, and we're going to send that to our SIM, which is QRadar today, for alerting. Right? So we're here in my XSOAR environment, And you can see I have several 100,000 indicators here coming in from different feeds. All the research that Kyle's done is already here in my environment. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up our firewall block list with our very high confidence, manually vetted intelligence. So I'm on the indicators page. This is where all of your threat intel comes in. And the first thing I need to do is start creating some sort of a filter, right? What am I going to actually send to my firewall? So I'm filtering on my active indicators, meaning, give me anything that's known to be active that has not been expired out of the platform, and give me anything tagged with that Bumblebee web shell that Kyle did all the research on. So you see here I have my list of indicators that match my filter. I'm going to grab that filter, and I'm going to go create an external dynamic list, right? This is just a list that the Palo Alto firewalls can easily consume. It's dynamically being updated based on the latest query. So you can see I've set one up already here. And all I've done is I've provided that query that we just built, and I chose how often should this list be updated. In this case, I did every hour. And once I do that, now at a specific endpoint on my XSOAR server, I have all of the indicators that match that query, and that list is always being updated based on the latest intelligence. And I can now send that to my firewall and use that for proactive blocking. Next, what I want to do is build a domain watch list for my SIEM, right? So this is going to be kind of after the fact alerting. So I'm willing to take on a little bit more riskier data here, something that hasn't been manually vetted. So I'm expanding my filter now to include anything also coming in from the autofocus feed. That's a particular feed that comes with XSOAR. And I'm filtering on domains because I'm making a domain watch list. So I'm going to copy that filter, and I'm now going to go and grab a playbook that we have. And this playbook takes indicators and pushes them to QRadar, right? So in this case, again, I'm providing the filter that I've built. And now I just need to tell the product, hey, run this playbook at some sort of interval, right? Always take that latest intelligence from that filter and push it to QRadar at some time. So I'm creating a job. This is very much like a cron job, right? So I'm saying every hour, execute this playbook. And that playbook takes my query, grabs the indicators, and pushes them to QRadar. And you can see it's already been running. So I can quickly pivot over to my QRadar environment here and take a look at my reference sets. And you can see here all the domains that match that initial query are now being pushed every hour to my QRadar infrastructure, where I can match that against my internal logs for alerting purposes. So that's a pretty quick run through of how we can create different lists for different use cases for different products and start getting some operational value out of that threat intelligence that you're collecting. All right, so just a few places to keep in mind as we start to wrap up here today. Definitely check out our product pages on the Palo Alto Networks website. There's both a page for the threat intel management specifically and the XSOAR product overall. We also have a community edition that you can download totally free. So download and experiment with that to check out some of the capabilities firsthand. And then also definitely check out and subscribe to the research coming out of the Unit 42 team. They're doing really great work over there. They have great visibility to networks across the world and are able to kind of use that to produce some really awesome research. So with that, I want to pass it over to Peter to do the Q&A.
Great. Okay, Ryan and Kyle, thank you for a wonderful presentation. We're going to go to Q&A, but before we do, I just want to remind everyone about the webinar survey that I mentioned earlier. It's available on the right of your presentation window. If you close the survey, you can reopen the widget. Just click the icon along the bottom of your screen. Thank you in advance for filling out the feedback form. Your participation in this survey helps us to serve you better in the future. Now let's move on to our question and answer portion. I just want to remind everyone it's not too late to type in a question. You can still ask Kyle and Ryan some questions. Just type your question into the text box that's located to the right of the presentation window. or you can click the Q&A icon. That's at the bottom of the screen. And let's take a look. We do have some questions. Someone says they're clapping. That's very nice. Okay, here's one. How do you prioritize your threat intelligence collection within Unit 42?
I'll go ahead and take that one, Peter. So really good question. And what Unit 42 specifically leverages is something we call prioritized collection requirements. And what those are is essentially just a list of different intelligence collection areas that we need to collect based on need. So for instance, one of our primary areas for collection and enrichment of intelligence is revolving around ransomware. And that's primarily due to not only our customer base seeing a lot of ransomware, but also just because of the general impact of ransomware. And then based on that, we'll also kind of extrapolate additional information down from that and basically say what families are we looking for, what functionalities within ransomware are we looking for, and where do we want to collect that from. And then in order to, at the end of the day, not only generate technical intelligence, but then also create proper product protections. In that way, we can detect any ransomware activity prior to our customers seeing it. So we leverage something internally called prioritized collection requirements, and it's meant to literally just drive where we're collecting and where we're enriching and in what priority we should do that.
Great. All right, our next question. Also about Unit 42. What internal and external tools do you leverage when you're performing threat hunting in Unit 42?
Yeah. I'll go ahead and take that one as well, Peter. So another good question. We use a litany of not only internally developed tools, but then also external tools. One of our internal tools that we leverage quite frequently is a tool that's called autofocus. And that's essentially one of the main ways that Unit 42 is able to distribute out enriched threat intelligence not only to our own researchers within Unit 42, but then also externally to our customer base. That's one of our own internal tools. Externally, we use all the kind of popular tools that some of you all might be familiar with. Passive Total being one of them, for instance, domain tools for doing domain pivots and IP infrastructure pivots. Virus Total to be able to look out and kind of do some pivoting and hunting there. So we use a litany of both internal and external, and we don't try to err on any one side being better than the other. We just try to use what's best.
Great. Okay. Another question. Here we go. What are the sources of your threat information? Is it all generated internally, or do you leverage other sources?
I think I'll take that one. So this is Ryan. So there are I saw a couple of questions about like what products do we integrate with and where is data coming from. So I'll try to answer all of them. In general, we have a pretty expansive set of integrations with the XSOAR product. We're up over 500 integrations now, and you can see the full list if you just do a Google search for XSOAR integrations. You'll see them there. But from the threat intel perspective, we have integrations with open source feeds. We have integrations with other threat intel vendors. We integrate, of course, with our own internal threat intel sources, folks like Unit 42, right, and autofocus that Kyle was just talking about. So we're very kind of vendor neutral, and we'll integrate with anyone from the XSOAR perspective. And then kind of on the outbound side, I showed QRadar and I talked about firewalls today, but we support other products as well there. Other SIM products, other firewall products, other EDR products. Again, you can find the complete list if you do a Google search for XSOAR integrations. So I hope that answered the question there. Kyle, anything to add?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Ryan.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. There's another question. I think this is also for Ryan. Firewalls have significant limitations on the volume of third-party indicators you can integrate into external block lists. Okay, here's the question. So given all that, what do you recommend that customers do to address this challenge?
Yeah, I'll take that one as well. So this is a super common problem across the industry, right? And with all security products, when you talk threat intelligence, they all have some sort of limit on how much data they can consume. Some products have, smaller limits than others. But I was showing in the demo, right, the ability to filter your indicators down. And that's kind of the key place is the filters I was showing were pretty simple. I was showing, give me domains with a specific tag. You can really expand those filters to get them really fine-grained to meet your needs. So you could say, for example, in the case of the firewall question, give me any IP addresses which are coming from only my high-confidence sources, which are known to be bad by my enrichment sources. And that can really help whittle down to only the highest priority indicators, and then you send those off to your device. So that's what something like a threat intelligence management platform can help you with, is prioritizing those indicators and sending them off to the specific devices.
One thing I'd like to add in here as well, if that's okay, Peter and Ryan, is directly to Ryan's point, is kind of the idea of vetting your threat intelligence sources. And what I mean by that is making sure that the sources that you're pulling in for intelligence are not only of high efficacy, but are also timely in nature. A lot of times with these types of blacklists and block lists that are created, oftentimes it's done with maybe a little bit stale data, right? And I can use IP addresses as a great example of that, because IP addresses might migrate what they're hosting, and that content might change day to day. So make sure that the intelligence feeds and the other intelligence sources that you're pulling in, not only raw, but enriched intelligence, make sure that those are highly vetted and make sure that they're highly accurate. That can reduce the noise that you're pulling in for those internal block lists and blacklists, and it can ultimately help reduce the amount of work that your firewall has to churn through. So just want to kind of make that point and help reinforce precisely what Ryan said, is basically making sure those enrichment sources are good to go.
Great. Well, it looks like we've answered our questions. So, Ryan, Kyle, any closing statements for the audience?
Nothing else from me. Just thank you, everyone, for the time today.
Yeah, thank you all very much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Okay, Ryan and Kyle, we thank you, too. Dark Reading appreciates your time and your expertise on today's topic. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, Palo Alto Networks. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience, too. We certainly appreciate your attention and your participation. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email. This will contain a link to today's presentation on demand and other details. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who couldn't join us today to listen to the event on demand. This webinar is copyright by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Palo Alto Networks. The individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and opinions. On behalf of Palo Alto Networks and Dark Reading, I'm Peter Krass. Thanks for your time, and have a great rest of your day.